From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons.
Kamala Harris and Donald Trump kick off the final week of the presidential campaign in Michigan and Georgia, just a day after Donald Trump's headline-grabbing rally at Madison Square Garden.
We'll have reaction this hour from someone who was there, Chapin Fay of Lighthouse Public Affairs. Plus, we'll speak with Marc Morial of the National Urban League ahead of Harris's closing argument speech on the National Mall tomorrow.
And we'll have the latest from the Middle East as Israel expresses openness to a short truce in Gaza after striking Iranian military targets over the weekend, leading to the biggest daily drop in crude oil prices in more than 2 years. Thanks for joining us on the Monday edition of Balance of Power here on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons. We'll get to geopolitics after an important weekend in the Middle East here, Kaylee. But of course, it's the presidential campaign that gets our attention after a wild night at Madison Square Garden.
Yep, a packed night at Madison Square Garden with a number of speakers taking the stage, not just Donald Trump. And some of those speakers, of course, had some off-color, racist, sexist remarks delivered that generated a lot of headlines. But there were new policy proposals suggested by Donald Trump as well, including another tax break specifically on people who care for family members. Another
deduction, another exemption now with 8 days left to the campaign, which is saying something. Here's a little taste of the candidates from their weekend on the trail.
When I say the enemy from within, the other side goes crazy, becomes a sound. Oh, how can he say? No, they've done very bad things to this country. They are indeed the enemy from within. But this is who we're fighting. These are the people who are doing such harm to our country with their open border policies.
This is not new about him, by the way. What he did last night is not a discovery. It is just more of the same and maybe more vivid than usual. Donald Trump spends full time trying to have Americans point their finger at each other, fans the fuel of hate and division, and that's why people are exhausted with him.
Joining us now is Bloomberg's Saleha Mohsin. So, Saleha, as we await Kamala Harris's closing argument speech at the Ellipse tomorrow, which is, of course, where Donald Trump spoke from on January 6, 2021, should we expect that a lot of that messaging is going to be playing on the division, the character of Donald Trump, potentially with references back to what went down in New York last night?
Yeah, Kaylee, it's interesting to see as we're barreling toward actual election day, even though Americans have already started to take their ballots through early voting and mail-ins. We're seeing Harris pick up on a theme from Biden in 2022, talking about the importance of saving democracy. And this was a campaign line that was attacked in the days after the assassination attempt on Trump's life in July. And so we don't know how it's going to resonate. I wonder if Harris in her campaign have some kind of insight as to what the final closing arguments should include and what voters who are undecided want to hear.
It's interesting to even see the Trump campaign distance itself from some of the rhetoric on the stage last night. This was over a 5-hour affair. Donald Trump spoke long after comedians and others from Tucker Carlson to Don Jr. The campaign said this joke, referring to the reference of Puerto Rico as an island of garbage. This joke does not reflect the views of President Trump or the campaign, unquote. Not everybody bought that line because this was a campaign event. They paid $1 million to rent out Madison Square Garden. They hired all the talent, didn't they?
Yeah, I mean, you know how this kind of thing works. Campaign spokespeople, campaign strategists, and staffers are all there. Their jobs are to find out what are people going to say when they take the stage on behalf of our campaign. So it's no surprise that people didn't really buy into it. Maybe it was one set of messages that is a little bit more bombastic was for one part of Trump's constituency, and the other part was to get some undecideds.
Well, and if Donald Trump has moved on after being in New York yesterday, he's in Georgia today. Are we going to see either of these candidates, aside from Kamala Harris in D.C. tomorrow, in anywhere other than a swing state between now and Election Day next Tuesday?
I know, and boy, they might regret that later, because the specter of 2016, when Hillary Clinton thought she was all sealed in Wisconsin and a couple of other states, may come back if there is a post-election mortem of the way this went.
All right, Bloomberg's Saleha Mohsin, thank you so much. Now, another election-related story that we're watching, a fire in a ballot box in Washington state destroyed hundreds of ballots in a county where the congressional race could help determine control of the House.
Clark County officials are working through the damaged ballots. If you're with us on Bloomberg TV, you can see what we're talking about. As many voters as possible. And the county's auditor, I should say, is encouraging anyone who put their ballot in the impacted ballot box to contact the county or to go to the state's voter portal to track their ballot. Taking a turn now to the Middle East, a new push for peace following Israel's retaliatory strike against Iran over the weekend. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu now says he is open to a short truce with Hamas in exchange for hostages, as proposed over the weekend by Egypt. President Biden had this to say about it earlier today.
We need a ceasefire. We should end this war. It should end, it should end, it should end.
Prime Minister Netanyahu stressed that negotiation under fire is better than negotiation during ceasefire. What do you think about that?
I'll reserve that for my discussion with him.
For more, we turn now to Bloomberg's Nick Wadhams, who had a busy weekend tracking all of this. Nick, just to begin with the retaliation that we saw Friday into Saturday, calculated to not escalate the conflict, the declines that we saw in oil prices would codify that. Does that suggest the Biden administration did have some influence on the way this was conducted?
I mean, that's certainly what the administration is telling us, that they had worked for weeks, essentially, to shape the Israeli response to Iran, and they had really two big issues. One was no strikes on Iran's energy network that could affect the price of oil, and the other one was nuclear sites, because they just felt that that would be so escalatory, represent a step that would just embroil the region even deeper into conflict. And the result, as you saw with the oil market, was essentially a feeling that they had gotten that calibration. They had successfully made that argument with Prime Minister Netanyahu. The result was what you saw was a situation intended to send a very strong signal. So they attacked facilities that produce these ballistic missiles that were fired into Israel on October 1st, and then also air defenses. So a show of strength. Listen, we got your air defenses. We can basically rule your skies. Just try us again. So that's sort of where we've ended up.
Just to reiterate, the moves in oil today, pretty incredible. Brent down more than 5%. The single worst day since July of 2022. It was the biggest one-day drop in WTI since November of 2021, more than 6 percentage points. So the oil market seems to be thinking, all right, we're all looking good here. There also is the question, and we heard President Biden speaking about it, of this ceasefire potential opportunity. Netanyahu signaling openness, we understand, to a short-term agreement. Is this actually close to being reality after months of back and forth, Nick?
I mean, we have been through this dance so many times before, where we have a potential signal from Israel, what they're saying to the U.S. and allies, that they may be willing to do this. But you fundamentally run up to an issue, which is that the Israeli government, Prime Minister Netanyahu, says we are not going to stop until Hamas is eradicated. And even after the death of Hamas leader Sinwar a week or so ago, he said, no, this marks the beginning of the end, but it is not the end. And they vow to keep on fighting. Hamas says they are unbowed. So you have a situation where Israel is saying, as long as Hamas is there, we're going to keep going. It's difficult to see how they would move beyond a temporary ceasefire to something more permanent, because that would then give Hamas the time to retrench and regain its strength, which is exactly the thing that Netanyahu doesn't want.
All right, Bloomberg's Nick Wadhams, another working weekend for him. Thank you for joining us on this Monday. Now, coming up, we'll look at the impact of Donald Trump's Madison Square Garden from last night with someone who was actually there. Chapin Fay, founder of Lighthouse Public Affairs, is with us next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio.
It shows that there is a dramatic decrease in the level of respect people have for each other, and certainly opponents have for each other. And I thought that last night was a new low in that regard. I mean, when we were champions in that arena, we were a diverse group of Americans from all over the country, different races, and we came together because of our unselfishness and our commitment to be the best we could be.
Bill Bradley, former Democratic senator from New Jersey and New York Knicks legend, on the early edition of Balance of Power today, discussing Trump's rally at Madison Square Garden last night. Joining us for more now on Bloomberg TV and radio is Chapin Fay. He's founder of Lighthouse Public Affairs and Republican strategist. He was at that rally yesterday. Chapin, thank you for joining us. I think we all know how this has gone down in the aftermath, the clips that have been circulating in the court of public opinion. You were there. How did all of it land in the room?
Listen, I think, some of these rallies are, if you were there, it's a lot different than what is reported or, some of the few naysayers. I will say there was a lot of energy. It was a lot more normal and regular than anyone anticipated, right? We all waited in line. We went in one by one. There was nothing going on in the crowd. There weren't even any real protesters that I saw, but he did fill Madison Square Garden completely. And there were, I don't know what the actual number was. It had dissipated by the time I had come out, but there were word that there was tens of thousands. I certainly saw thousands of people watching on the street who didn't get in. And I will say, we've read some of the coverage of some of the comments and everything, particularly by the comedian. I would note that no one refers to him as a comedian when they're talking about the things that he said. So I think it's important to be clear that he was making jokes. And I would also say that I just don't, I'm a fan of his. He has a very popular show. He was great on the Tom Brady roast, but I think that the jokes that people are harping on or seizing on actually fell flat in the room, right? The Puerto Rico joke, I mean, there were barely any laughs to that one. Some of his other lines got a lot more laughs. So, I'm not sure. It was also very early on, so maybe people weren't paying attention, but I'm not sure that they landed in the room. So I think the criticism of the comedian is warranted, right? If you don't like what he said, but I think some of this criticism and some of the comments about Nazi rallies. I mean, it's ridiculous, right? I mean, there have been a number of presidential candidates, both Republicans and Democrats, for decades doing rallies at Madison Square Garden, including Clinton, including Ike, LBJ, Nixon. Both Republicans and Democrats have had their conventions there. I went to one in 2004 with Governor Pataki, and I would also say. You have like Ellen Barkin wishing that Jews, calling for a Jewish man to suffer at the fate of Nazis because of what happened yesterday. I mean, this is ridiculous. The rhetoric on the left is out of control. There was a Holocaust survivor in the crowd, a Holocaust survivor who has asked for an apology from Kamala Harris. He was in the crowd, and I think we should probably follow his lead about whether this was a Nazi rally or not. And I think people need to bring the rhetoric down a little bit. I think this is the end of a campaign, and you're seeing perhaps both sides, but certainly on Kamala's side, all throw in the kitchen sink, right? I mean, if you can't fight someone on policy, let's just call him a Nazi. I mean, it's ridiculous.
Well, all right, fair enough. Or you can call him, in the case of Sid Rosenberg, who was on alongside the comedian, he called Doug Emhoff a crappy Jew. He called Democrats a bunch of degenerates, lowlifes, and Jew haters. Donald Trump's friend David Rem referred to Harris as the Antichrist last night, Chapin. We heard about from Grant Cardone, Kamala Harris's pimp handlers. Pretty tough stuff. I mean, you couldn't tell half of these jokes or read half of these lines at the Thanksgiving table this week. So, yes, it's getting hot, aside from the comedian. So I guess the question is this effective in the 11th hour for Donald Trump?
I think the rally is effective. I think the Democrats are taking the bait.
The rhetoric.
I mean, the more you call the rhetoric. Sorry, the rhetoric has been this way for a while. And I would also point out that there is a long distinguished tradition of the left calling Republican candidates racist and Nazis. Al Gore accused George W. Bush of sending brown shirts after him. Mitt Romney was called misogynist because of binders of women. Mitt Romney, the left and the Democrats' favorite never-Trumper today, was called a misogynist because of that comment. John McCain was called a racist, even though he has non-white children. So the fact that they're calling Donald Trump at the 25th hour here a Nazi over and over again is not surprising, and it's a little disappointing. And sure, were some things said at this rally that maybe were difficult or not the best things to say? Sure, but this is in the context of a man who has been shot at and has been called a Nazi since the day he announced. So I don't really know what to tell you about the rhetoric. I mean, when someone is called a Nazi on the front page of newspapers, I mean, how do you expect people to respond? How do you expect a Jewish radio host to respond to that? exactly how he did.
Okay, so Chapin, let's put the name calling on all sides of this aside and actually talk about the policy that is being discussed. There was some of it on that stage last night. There's still 8 days for both Donald Trump and Kamala Harris to make their closing arguments here. To get back to Joe's question, was the policy that was discussed that was maybe drowned out by a lot of this other noise enough to seal the deal for Donald Trump, or should he be trying to speak differently about the issues in these final days?
Well, I think a lot of this is baked in, particularly in the center of Manhattan, right? The people who traveled to see him and were standing outside, like I said, are all voting for him. It's already baked in. And I'm sure I've said things like this, and I'm sure other guests have said this. It almost doesn't matter what Donald Trump says to his base, right? That's baked in. Same thing for Kamala Harris voters, right? New York City Democrats are not going to watch this rally no matter what is said, no matter how moderate or nice a person Donald Trump can be. They're just not going to entertain anything that came out of it, right? So I do think the policies did get drowned out by a lot of what was said, which is unfortunate, right? We're talking about a comedian rather than the policy. Well, you're trying to, but we spent all day talking about a comedian instead of the policy. So I do think that was problematic, right, for the event. However, I do think it shows a lot of energy, and I do think while Donald Trump is not going to win New York, I do think he's going to overperform in a lot of areas, and people are going to be surprised. I think he's going to have coattails, particularly on Long Island. He may have coattails, in the Lawler district upstate, Molinaro and Allison Esposito. And I think, you're seeing that. A lot of those folks were there or supportive of it. You saw Mike Lawler put out a statement about the remarks today, distancing himself. But I do think that and a lot of Republicans have done that, certainly in Florida, too. Again, I thought the joke fell flat.
I wanted to ask you about that part of it, Chapin. You're right. Rick Scott, we heard from Maria Elvira Salazar. We also heard from Anthony D'Esposito, of course, New York congressman. And that's the question that I have for you. The potential corrosive effect that some of the language last night might have on members of the House from New York. D'Esposito put out a statement begging Trump world to, quote, stay on message. What does it mean for him?
Well, I think it's not great, right? I do think, and it's a shame. It was not a shame, but it's ironic. It was not a comment from Donald Trump, right, that is causing this consternation. Yes. But I do think, and again, I understand he's a comedian, right? And his defenses, he was making fun of a lot of different people and categories of people. But you have to be funny, right? I will tell you, it just did not land. I turned to the people I was with and sort of shrugged my shoulders, like, what was that? And I do think, but it is going to have an effect, right? That's what the media is talking about. That's what we're talking about. And in marginal races, right, very contested races, Congressman D'Esposito is in the fight of his life. So we can't make any unforced errors, is how we talk about it in campaign business, right? And this is an unforced error out of the Trump camp, right, from the Garden. Congressman Lawler, too, right? One of the top targeted campaigns in the country, millions of dollars being spent. He is also in the fight of his life. While I do think he's going to pull it off, it's certainly going to be close. And things like this certainly don't help. I would say, though, realpolitik crass tactics, his ability to distance himself from Trump in this manner may work, right, for him. He has been doing that, picking his battles. He's a moderate, and he's in a swing district, for lack of a better term. So I do think distancing himself from Trump and that event will have a good effect for him. Same thing with D'Esposito, who was also in a similar fight on Long Island. So I think they're trying to thread a needle where they distance themselves from the president when it will help them, and still be a supporter of his when that will help him. We'll see if it works, right? Both of these districts, particularly, I grew up in D'Esposito's district, very purple district. Even blue these days.
That's right. Siena today. Siena College has him down 12 percentage points in that race, which is one that we'll be watching closely on election night next week. Chapin, thank you for joining us and sharing your experience with us. Chapin Fay, founder of Lighthouse Public Affairs, Republican strategist here on Bloomberg. Coming up, the U.S. Army works with tech companies to speed weapons development.
What we've learned is we have to change how we buy things, and especially in the rapid, the areas where technology is moving very rapidly.
We'll have that story next from the Pentagon here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. The U.S. Army says it wants to change how it does business. And Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall sat down with the head of that process at the Pentagon and is here with the story. Tyler?
Yeah, hey, Kaylee. The U.S. Army is looking to speed up its weapons and development acquisition process. That's according to the U.S. Army Chief of Staff, General Randy George. He's a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. In his first ever TV interview, General George told me he's looking to shift the Army's buying models in a bid to make sure equipment isn't outdated by the time it gets into the hands of U.S. troops. The vision would overhaul how business in the Pentagon is typically done. A recent Army report says it can take on average 2 years of approvals and funding requirements just to get weapons out the door.
Things are going to change. I think we're seeing that 3 weeks, 3 months, definitely inside of a year or 2 years. We can't say, hey, we're going to buy something and it's going to be ready 2 years from now because we know the technology is going to advance beyond that.
General George is focused on buying cutting-edge weapons, think drones and electronic warfare systems, in smaller batches instead of long-term purchase orders. This more flexible process is being piloted as part of an Army initiative called Transforming in Contact. It looks to flood select brigades with the equipment and fast. The Army is letting private sector engineers work alongside soldiers to get real-time feedback on the product so they can then adjust from there.
As long as we're buying things that are modular, open system architecture, we can continue to update in our formations, and that's what we need to be able to do.
How do you make this economically viable for those companies that are already competing in the commercial marketplace that often moves a lot faster?
I think what we're doing is trying to do a better job of explaining what we need, and rather than have hundreds of pages of requirements to try to define what it is, we're working with industry and putting out a characterization of needs, and we've done that a couple of times where we've kind of described the problem that we're trying to solve. And what we found is that industry can come back very quickly, and we've been surprised by the solutions that we're providing.
It's creating access for more non-traditional contractors to compete in a defense industrial base that's estimated to have shrunk 40% in the last decade. That's mostly due to consolidation by some of the biggest defense contractors. Joan Cayley, the Army has worked with about 24 companies as part of this initiative. That includes names like Palantir and Elon Musk's SpaceX.
All right, Tyler Kendall, great work. Thanks for the reporting. Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall on Balance of Power. Coming up, we'll have a closer look at each candidate's appeal to minority voters in the election's final push. Marc Morial, president and CEO of the National Urban League, former Democratic mayor of New Orleans, will be with us next. It's only here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Let me warn you, your rage does not exist in a vacuum. If we don't get this election right, your wife, your daughter, your mother, we as women will become collateral damage to your rage.
Michelle Obama over the weekend in Michigan working the stump alongside Kamala Harris in an appeal to voters on the issue of reproductive rights, speaking specifically to men on this issue. And joining us now is Marc Morial, the president CEO of the National Urban League, former Democratic mayor of the great city of New Orleans. Mr. Mayor, it's good to see you. Thank you so much for being back with us here on Bloomberg. I wonder your thoughts on this. Michelle Obama, pretty effective surrogate for Kamala Harris there, speaking directly to young black men, young men in general. I just wonder if you buy this idea that we're seeing borne out in the polls, that Donald Trump, as a Republican, has a record level of support from young black men, and Kamala Harris can't seem to crack this. How do you see it?
Well, first, let me offer these thoughts in my personal capacity. I was in Detroit, Philadelphia, and Atlanta, and I think the storyline that large numbers of young black men are moving to Trump is exaggerated and overblown, just like so much that comes from Trump world. But there is no doubt, in this instance, many black men whose votes are competitive, who are up for grabs. And so Kamala Harris has got to earn those votes by educating people about both her platform, her stance, and her record, and by reminding people that Donald Trump is the man who called for the execution of those 5 young black men who were unfairly accused of a horrible crime in Central Park in 1989. And even after they were exonerated, he refused to back off. So her job is to remind people about Trump, but to educate people about her record and her platform.
Well, Marc, we spoke about this group of voters on the early edition of Balance of Power. Joe spoke with John Levy, director of the Siena College Research Institute, and this is what he had to say, and we'll have you respond.
If you look at the black vote, a lot was made early in the campaign about some erosion, most especially amongst young black men, away from the Democratic side of the ticket. That seems to have returned. Hispanics, very much in play, a small margin for Harris. So really it's going to come down to these subgroups and who turns out at rates greater or less than what they have historically turned out.
And that turnout, I think, Marc, is what you're alluding to as you say she needs to earn these votes. She still has a week left, including a speech tomorrow at the Ellipse here in Washington. What does she need to say on the issues to earn them?
I think she's got to paint the clear contrast between the future direction she would take the country and the direction that Donald Trump would take the country. It is a fault line between democracy and autocracy. And it is a clear distinction between 2 different approaches to the American economy, and not to mention many personal freedom issues like economic justice, like reproductive freedom, like minimum wage. A lot of these issues, these candidates are in different places on. I also believe quite clearly that it's a distinction between an approach to governing, which is about coalition building. It's about multi-racial, multi-religious, multi-region, multi-ethnicity, and Donald Trump's sort of divide and conquer politics. So she's got to make that case. So it's the balance of making a strong case for yourself while at the same time prosecuting the case against your opponent and striking that balance. You don't want to be too negative. You also can't just give a rosy 4th of July presentation as well. I think it's notable that she's going to the Ellipse. She's going to the site of the crime, the site of the coup. I call it an attempted coup, the site of the insurrection, for which Donald Trump is currently being investigated and for which many people, literally hundreds of people, have been arrested, prosecuted, and many have been jailed because law enforcement officers died that day at the Capitol.
We had a pronounced, I think I can describe, conversation earlier this hour, Marc, about some of the rhetoric that we heard last night at Madison Square Garden. I don't know if you watched or heard any of this Trump rally, but there was a comedian who upset a lot of people with some of the jokes that he delivered. He was not alone. There were a number of folks who talked before Donald Trump who said things that I actually cannot say on the air as part of this question because I'd be fired. That comedian, though, who had the line about Puerto Rico that actually drew condemnation from the Trump campaign itself, also talked about a black man in the crowd, said that he carved watermelons with him. And I'm just wondering, Marc, as we heard people laughing at some of these lines, where you think we are with racial discourse here in 2024, because everybody's saying it out loud.
This was an unforced error by the Trump and Trump campaign. You can't distance yourself from speakers you chose and you should have vetted at your own rally. It is disappointing. It is troubling. It is surprising in some ways that here we are in 2024 and some people would laugh at condemnation, racial tropes, and racial stereotypes. I like to think we're bigger than that as a nation. I'd like to think that our leaders have always found a way, regardless of party, to rise above that type of garbage, that type of rhetoric, that type of hatred. But it seems that once again, whether it's January 6th, whether it's Charlottesville, that the Trump campaign is infected with racist, misogynist, haters, ethnocentrics, Nazis, and others. They have found a political home in Trump world. And the question on the ballot, one of the questions on the ballot, is that the direction that this great nation that is now on the brink of its 250th anniversary wants to take? This next president will lead us past this historic anniversary. And I just believe that we need leadership that's going to build us, bind us, bring us together, and forge a new direction. We have to turn the page beyond that. I think that is contagious, just like tolerance and respect is contagious. And leaders lead by example.
Well, as we consider anniversaries here, the National Urban League is also commemorating the 60th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act, and it does raise questions about equality, knowing the 2024 Equality Index lists Black Americans at 75.7%, 100% would be true racial parity. What do you say to voters in this demographic who think Donald Trump's policies may better aid getting to that 100% than Kamala Harris's?
Boy, if you think that, you've done no research, you've done no reading, you're living in fantasy land. Donald Trump's history as a business person and as president was not to practice any form of inclusion or diversity, and he hasn't advanced one single policy. He inherited the Obama economy. Let me say that again. He inherited the Obama economy, which had experienced 75 straight months of job growth, and the biggest thing he did was not screw it up. And then all he did was add to the deficit with a massive tax cut for rich Americans. When he faced his first crisis, which was a big crisis, and that is COVID, he melted under pressure. He became discombobulated, unglued, critical, egomaniacal about it was something being done to him. And we wasted many, many, many months in effectively responding, when as a nation, we expect our leaders to bring us together and respond in a crisis. So those who think that, I say, check the record, not the rhetoric. This is a test of not style, but substance. And the Harris effort, and I think the Biden effort, people criticize Joe Biden, some unfairly, because he took an economy which was in the ditch and helped to bring it back to where we have not the economy we want, but a better economy than we had the day he took office. And that's what I think people should remember. I like to clear the record. Donald Trump wants to run away from his last year in office. Talk about his first 3 years when he inherited the Obama economy. Pretend as though the last year didn't happen. Well, guess what? I remember those days where 50 million Americans were out of work, where thousands of Americans were dying each week. And he fiddled and faddled and told us we should use bleach.
All right, we have to leave it there. Marc Morial, president and CEO of the National Urban League and former Democratic mayor of New Orleans. Thank you for joining us. Coming up, we'll have more on that Donald Trump rally in Madison Square Garden and Kamala Harris hitting the trail with Michelle Obama, how each candidate is shaping their closing argument. That's next with our signature panel on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
We got to get the congressmen elected, and we got to get the senators elected, because we can take the Senate pretty easily. And I think with our little secret, we're going to do really well with the House, right? Our little secret is having a big impact. He and I have a secret. We'll tell you what it is when the race is over.
Donald Trump apparently sharing his secret with the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, last night at Madison Square Garden. Just one of the lines delivered by him and the other speakers on that stage that raised some eyebrows. Joining us now for more here on Bloomberg TV and radio is our signature panel, Rick Davis, Stonecourt Capital partner, and Jeannie Shanzano, political science professor at Iona University and senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study for the Presidency and Congress. Thanks to you both for being here to kick us off on a Monday. As always, Rick, it was quite the Sunday. We've talked about it extensively this hour already. Some of the off-color remarks that were made, whether it was about Kamala Harris's race, her gender, Puerto Rico being an island of garbage. Rick, for all of that, the question is, did that change anything about this race fundamentally? It's still October. Was that the surprise?
Yeah, I think that if that's an October surprise, it's probably the worst October surprise of any in history. Look, I mean, it was unforced errors has been talked about. I think it's a great way to describe it. Here's, Donald Trump's chance to glorify himself in the place that he's always loved, Madison Square Garden. This was the pinnacle of his career in politics. He's never going to run for another office after this. And it gets totally blown away by the undercard, which, as Joe said earlier, you can't even repeat some of this stuff. It's, GP rated beyond that. And so the bottom line is they botched it. It should have been about Donald Trump. It should have been about his message. And all of that went off the rails to the point where even the Trump campaign had to play cleanup, and they never do that. So, yeah, it was a mess.
They did have to issue a statement specific to that joke about Puerto Rico, Jeannie. I have to be honest. I want to go back to where we started this conversation with a secret. This is one of the many things said last night that hasn't gotten any coverage and normally might be a pretty big story here. Our little secret is having a big impact, Donald Trump said. He and I have a secret, referring to Speaker Johnson. We'll tell you what it is when the race is over. Knowing the role that Mike Johnson tried to play in helping to overturn the results of the 2020 election, Jeannie, what's he talking about?
Yeah, it's anybody's guess. I think it was a sort of a dog whistle by Donald Trump, one of the kinds of Easter eggs he likes to drop to his followers to say that if there is any, result in this election that we don't like, Mike Johnson is the one responsible. If I was Mike Johnson, I would be frightened and have run out of that MSG. Well, I would have run out a long time earlier, but upon hearing that, because look at what happened to Mike Pence, his own vice president. So I thought that was a very ominous thing to say. But again, to your point, it was so much less, vile and disgusting than much of what came before it, that it hasn't gotten the attention it deserved. And that is par for the course with a Trump rally.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and it isn't just any rally. It might very well be his big closing argument. Kamala Harris is going to deliver hers tomorrow at the Ellipse here in Washington. Jeannie, what does she need to say to avoid an unforced error? What does she need to say to actually improve her case?
I think what she needs to do is she needs to make sure that she is making the case, number one, that Donald Trump is unfit, unhinged, and unrestricted, which is the argument they've been making. Number two, that she is prepared to address the challenges that our Americans are facing. And she is going to ensure, number one, that people retain their freedom to reproductive health. And she is going to fix the economy and the border. So I think she needs to do those things. But this rally, given where it is, I think we are going to hear a lot of arguments about Donald Trump being unhinged, unrestricted if he is reelected, that he won't have guardrails around him this time. And what happened just 24 hours ago in Madison Square Garden is just another, really frustrating and unfortunate reminder of that.
We should note that Kamala Harris, Tim Walz, will be hitting all 7 presidential swing states over the course of this week, beginning with Michigan today. So while Washington, D.C. isn't on that map, they seem to be hitting them all here. Rick, what's your thought when people look at this image tomorrow? They're going to recognize that spot, I presume, where Donald Trump stood on January 6th. I know you don't think this is necessarily the best time spent for Kamala Harris. So how does she use this to be most impactful?
Yeah, well, I mean, for 2 reasons, I don't think it's a good idea. One is she's in Washington, D.C., so it reminds everybody that they've been in this administration for, almost 4 years now. And people are not particularly happy with the state of the economy, the state of the country, the state of the foreign policy. So she's like bringing it right back to their memory, saying, oh, yeah, I have an office right over there in stone's throw from this spot, in the White House, where I've been screwing up the country for the last 4 years. I mean, that's the problem with being in Washington during an election. Nothing good is ever attributed to that place. Then she's going to talk about January 6th and Donald Trump's role in that, regardless of what Jeannie just said, which is all the right stuff to talk about. She's going to talk about January 6th because otherwise she wouldn't be in the mall. And the reality is, I don't think she's going to educate any voters as to what happened there. They know it. It's been litigated for 4 years, and it should be. but it's nothing new. So the bottom line is, I think it is an unforced error, has great potential to backfire on her, just like the overthinking of a Madison Square Garden event did for the Donald Trump campaign. So, I really don't think this is an impressive close of the campaign right now.
2 forced errors with 8 days to go. Coming up, our panel sticks with us as we look at how some of the key congressional races are tightening just a week out from Election Day. Rick Davis, Jeannie Shanzano have a lot more next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
It is going to have an effect, right? That's what the media is talking about. That's what we're talking about. And in marginal races, right, very contested races, Congressman D'Esposito is in the fight of his life. So we can't make any unforced errors is how we talk about it in campaign business.
It's Chapin Fay, Republican strategist, Lighthouse Public Affairs, talking with us a short time ago on the heels of the big event at Madison Square Garden last night, the Trump campaign. Back with us now, our signature political panel, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, Bloomberg Politics contributors. Great to have you both with us here. When you consider, if we can combine these stories for a moment, what happened last night to down ballot races, there are a lot of candidates like the aforementioned Congressman D'Esposito who are at the mercy of a lot of outside factors. And a moment like that last night isn't entirely helpful. Rick Davis, how important, for instance, is the New York delegation going to be? Republicans serving in the House from the state of New York and determining the balance of power in the House of Representatives.
Oh, I think it's critically important. I mean, you imagine the depression after this event on Sunday night, thinking somehow when you were going in, oh, this is going to be great. The troops are going to get rallied up. These are all people in our districts around the city. And you see that flop, and all of a sudden you're like depressed. Look, between California and the 4 seats that are available there and 4 seats in New York, that's the top 10 swingers in the congressional contest that could decide the fate of who's going to be the Speaker of the House. And so, the New York delegation, I mean, this is critical time for them right now. And so I think that laying an egg in Madison Square Garden was exactly what they were hoping wouldn't happen.
Easter egg, I think, is what Rick's referring to there, maybe. So that's the House side. Jeannie, I want to ask you about the Senate, in part because I know you got a bet going on the Texas Senate race, and we got new New York Times Siena polling today. 46 Colin Allred, 50% Ted Cruz. And in Nebraska, Deb Fischer only 2 points ahead of her independent challenger, Dan Osborne. What do you think when you see these figures?
Well, Kayleigh, I will tell you that Mr. Easter Egg over here, when I saw him today, I said I probably lost this bet to you in Texas, but I'm still hopeful that Colin Allred comes through. Obviously, very, very tough for Colin Allred, and the latest polls don't look particularly promising, but I'm still holding out hope. I think Nebraska is the race so many of us are watching. It's probably one of the most exciting races out there this cycle. And Osborne, really is a really fascinating candidate, rejected the Democrats' endorsement, running as an independent. Republicans didn't think they were going to have to spend so much money there, but boy, do they have to. And so I think that is going to be the race in terms of the Senate that we all look to. And of course, we still don't know if he will caucus with the Democrats or Republicans if he is elected. So a lot at stake out in Nebraska.
Seems to be suggesting neither in the interview I saw on ABC News yesterday. Rick Davis, Dan Osborne, even if he does not win this race, becomes a clinic in how to do it right, going up against an incumbent, right?
Yeah, for sure. And by the way, Rayo's, you might want to call him right away. It takes a long time to get a reservation there for a good steak dinner. But yeah, look, I mean, I think Osborne's campaign is going to be dissected as something extraordinary in this cycle. It's pretty unique in the fact that it's been as successful as it has, maybe partly because we just weren't paying that much attention to it, and it could just happen out locally, without a lot of national attention. Because you do see that when the money comes in and the national exposure, hits it, it changes the nature of the race. And so, look, I mean, I think that a lot of these incumbents are going to survive. They've all had their sort of heart attack moment. But a lot of money came in from the Senate Leadership Fund and others to prop up our candidates. And I think most of these incumbents are going to be in fine shape. I can't see a scenario right now, frankly, where the Democrats can hold the Senate. So maybe divided government, at least in Congress.
Yeah.
All right, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, thank you both so much for joining us. And, of course, for more coverage, check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online.
He knows where all the good steakhouses are, Rick Davis. Thanks for joining us on Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg.